The galaxy had known peace for 6,000 years, but it was not the peace born of kindness, nor the kind that grows from trust or friendship between disparate peoples. It was a peace held together by fear. It was a peace maintained by an iron fist so vast and powerful that no one dared to raise their voice, let alone a weapon. The Galactic Union was that iron fist. It was a coalition of over 400 alien species, stretching across 3 full spiral arms of the Milky Way. It possessed countless warships. It had weapons capable of splitting a moon in 2. It had laws written over millennia. And it had soldiers, billions of them, sworn to carry out these laws without question or pity. For 6,000 years, the Galactic Union had been the supreme authority in the known galaxy. Were there uprisings? Yes, small rebellions on distant worlds, pirates and smugglers, border disputes between member states. But no one, not a single civilization in the recorded history of the Union's subjects, had ever stood against the full might of the Empire and survived to tell the tale. The subjects liked it that way. The Senate that governed all 400 member states sat on a planet called Velprime. It was a beautiful world with golden plains and deep blue oceans, its capital stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Towers of pale stone rose into the clouds. Ships moved through the sky like schools of fish in the sea. The streets were filled with creatures of all shapes, colors, and sizes. They all lived under the protection of the most powerful government the galaxy had ever known. On the fringes of controlled space lay a region called the Outer Rim. It was a cold and mostly empty stretch of the galaxy, a place of dead stars and shattered asteroid fields, long stretches of dark space where nothing interesting ever happened. The Union kept sensor stations there, staffed by low-ranking soldiers who spent most of their time doing nothing. It was considered a punishment. If you did something wrong in the Union military, you were sent to the Outer Rim. Sensor Station Keth was one of the most boring posts in the entire Outer Rim. It was located on a small, rocky moon orbiting a dead brown dwarf star. At any given time, there were 12 soldiers there. They watched deep space. They filed reports that no one read. They ate their meals in silence and counted the days until their rotation ended. The soldier on duty the night everything changed was a young Cerulite named Saville. Cerulites were reptilian, gray with green skin, large golden eyes, and long, thin fingers designed for fine work. Saville was 23 standard Union years old. He had been on Keth for 8 months. During that time, he had filed 242 sensor reports, and not a single one had contained anything worth so much as a nod. He was eating cold food and staring at his sensor screen when the reading appeared. At first, he thought it was a glitch. The sensor showed an object moving in deep space, roughly 60 light-years from the edge of the Outer Rim. In itself, that was not unusual. Space was full of objects, comets, asteroids, old dead satellites of civilizations that no longer existed. But what made Saville put down his food and lean forward was not the object itself. It was the speed. The object was moving faster than Saville had ever seen on a sensor screen, not faster than could be explained by a standard hyperdrive. Hyperdrive travel was the technology used by all species in the Union. It folded space around a ship, allowing it to cover vast distances in a short time. But this object was not folding space. There were no hyperspace signatures, no wave effects, no usual trails left by a ship in jump. This object was simply moving through normal space at a speed that should have been physically impossible. Saville checked the sensor calibration. He ran diagnostics. He checked again. The reading was real. He analyzed the object's energy signature. That was when a chill gripped his chest. The energy radiating from the object was colossal. It was not the clean, efficient energy of a Union ship running on standard power. It was raw, hot, and almost violent energy. The object was pouring energy into its engines the way a dying star pours light into space without care, without economy, without a single thought for how much it was using. Whatever it was burning bright and approaching fast. Saville filed an emergency report. He marked it as high priority, the first such report in 8 months. Then he leaned back in his chair and watched the sensor screen, feeling the hair on the back of his neck, if a Cerulite had any, stand on end. The report reached Outer Rim Command within an hour. The duty officer at command was a Dominion officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kett. The Dominion was the most powerful species in the Union, large blue-skinned creatures with 4 arms and a long history of military dominance. Kett had been a soldier for 30 years. He had seen a lot. He looked at Saville's report and frowned. Then he looked at it again. He received the raw sensor data directly. He compared it to all known ship classifications. In the Union database, he compared the energy signature against the library. Out of over 2,000 registered alien propulsion systems, he found nothing that matched. The database returned one result marked unknown. Anomaly. No matches found. Ket sent the message up the chain of command. He did not mark it as high priority, he marked it as urgent. By the time the message reached the Admiralty of the Outer Rim Regional Command, the object had crossed another 2 light-years. It had not slowed down. It had not changed course. It was moving in a straight line directly toward Union territory, as if it knew exactly where it was going and had no interest in hiding that fact. The Admiralty dispatched 3 scout cruisers. Scout cruisers were fast, lightly armed ships designed specifically for such situations. An unidentified object in deep space that needed to be identified and, if necessary, engaged. The 3 cruisers moved in formation. Their commanders were experienced officers. They had intercepted unknown signals before. It was routine. Or at least, that was what they told themselves. The first cruiser, the KKS Virat, was the first to reach the object's sensor range. The commander of the Virat, a veteran Seralite, Captain Orland, looked at his tactical screen and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt fear. The object was a ship. That became clear as they got close enough to see it directly on visual sensors. But it was a ship unlike any Orland had ever seen. It was huge, but not in the way Union capitals were huge, with their clean geometric lines and carefully engineered hull sections. This ship looked as if it had been built, rebuilt, and rebuilt again, over and over, for a very long time. The hull was covered in patches, welds, and repairs. Great scars ran along its sides, signs of impacts and burns that spoke of battles Orland couldn't even imagine. Parts of it looked almost ancient. Other parts looked newer, added as if the ship had been growing for centuries. And it was burning not with fire, but its engines were spewing energy at a level that made the Virat's sensors scream from overload. The light emanating from the ship's engine ports was blue-white, like something operating beyond design limits. And yet, the ship wasn't falling apart. It held together. It moved forward. It didn't slow down. Orland tried to contact the ship on all standard frequencies. He transmitted the standard Union hailing code, a signal every registered ship in Union space was required to answer. He sent it 7 times on 7 different bands. There was no answer. He ordered the Virat to get into the object's path, a standard intercept maneuver, placing his ship directly in front of the incoming object to force it to either stop or change course. The Virat's navigator had barely finished the maneuver when the proximity alarm sounded. The unknown ship didn't slow down, didn't turn, and didn't react to them at all. It just continued on its path. Orland gave the order for an emergency course change. The Virat's engines howled. The ship jerked sideways. It wasn't fast enough. The unknown ship passed within 200 kilometers of the Virat at full speed. The shockwave hit like a physical wall. The Virat was tossed away, tumbling. Its systems flashed, died, and rebooted in quick succession. Orland was hit so hard against his safety harness that his vision went black for several seconds. When he could see again, his bridge was full of smoke and sparks, and every screen showed damage reports in urgent red. The Virat had survived, but barely. It drifted in space, its systems struggling to come back online. The second cruiser, the KKS Drat, reported that it had been completely flipped by the shockwave and had lost all primary thrust. It was slowly spinning in the void. The third cruiser didn't report at all. Orland later learned that the KKS Orvin had ended up directly in the path of the ship and hadn't been able to move in time. The shockwave hit it point blank. There were no survivors. 1 cruiser destroyed, 2 heavily damaged. 312 Union soldiers died, not from weapons, but from the wake of a ship that hadn't even noticed them. The report that reached Outer Rim Command 20 minutes later was not marked as urgent. There was a classification above urgent that hadn't been used in over 200 years. It was called Absolute Emergency and was intended for situations threatening the stability of the Union itself. Ket used it. The message burned through the Union communications networks with maximum priority. It was marked and escalated at every relay station it passed through. By the time it reached the capital on Vel Prime, it had been read by 14 different admirals, 6 Union senators, and the personal staff of the Supreme Commander of the Dominion Fleet. The Union Senate convened an emergency session within 3 hours. The hall was a vast, circular room in the center of the capital. It could hold representatives from all 400 member states. It was rarely full. The day the alert came in, there was not a single empty seat. High Admiral Vilkrat stood in the center of the room and read the report. Vilkrat was a large creature, even by Dominion standards. He had participated in 7 wars. He commanded fleets of 10,000 ships. He was the type of soldier who did not show fear easily. His hands trembled slightly as he read. The hall exploded. When he finished, voices in hundreds of different languages rose simultaneously. Species that hadn't spoken to each other in decades were suddenly shouting across the room. The noise was so great that the session chairman was forced to activate the emergency silence system, a low-frequency pulse that suppressed all sound in the room for 3 seconds to regain control. Vilkrat laid out what they knew. An unidentified ship of unknown origin had entered Union space from beyond the outer rim. It didn't match any known ship design. Its energy output exceeded everything in the Union's technical database. It had destroyed 1 scout cruiser and disabled 2 others without using a single weapon, simply by flying past them at speed. Now it was moving deeper into Union territory on a course that, if continued, would take it to the inner systems within days. A senator from the Brith species, small, nervous, and quick creatures known for their expertise in xenobiology, asked the question on everyone's mind. Who built it? Vilkrat looked at the senator. We don't know. The hall fell silent again. We compared the ship's energy profile and its construction style against every species in the Union database and every known pre-spacefaring civilization in the records, Vilkrat continued. No matches. This ship does not belong to any species we have ever encountered. So it came from outside the galaxy, another senator said. That is one possibility, Vilkrat said, and not one that comforts me. The ensuing debate lasted 6 hours. Some senators wanted to immediately dispatch the entire battle fleet. Others called for caution, arguing that any species capable of building such a ship would not be intimidated by a show of force. Others, a smaller, quieter group, said the Union should try to establish contact before doing well. What? In the end, the Senate voted to mobilize the Outer Rim Defensive Fleet as a precaution. 4,000 warships began moving into formation along the border of the Outer Rim. Orders were also issued to deep space relay stations to broadcast all known Union greeting protocols on all frequencies toward the unknown ship. There was no response. 48 hours after Savel's first alert, the unknown ship crossed the Outer Rim border, entering Union space without stopping. It didn't answer a single call. It didn't deviate from its course. It moved like something that had made a decision long ago and was simply following it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. It froze near a dead star system on the very edge of the Outer Rim, a region of space without inhabited planets, without stations, without strategic value. It just stopped there and went completely dark. All the sensor readings that had been shining with its enormous energy dropped almost to 0. The ship was still there. Union sensors could still detect its mass, but it had stopped burning, stopped moving, stopped doing anything. It was waiting for something no one in the Union Senate could name. The hall on Vel Prime buzzed with theories, fears, and arguments that grew louder as the hours passed. And the ship sat silently, motionless and unresponsive. In the operations center of Outer Rim Command, Lieutenant Colonel Kett stood at a long table covered in sensor displays and tactical summaries. Officers were constantly moving around him, delivering reports, updating maps, conducting analyses. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He stared at the single dot on the galactic map that represented the unknown ship, a small point of light in a vast field of stars. He had participated in many battles over 30 years. He had met many enemies. He had never felt that particular feeling that had settled in his chest for the last 2 days. He recognized it, though. He had heard old soldiers describe it. He had read about it in historical texts covering the Union's earliest and most dangerous conflicts. It was horror, not the fear of a known danger, not the clean, manageable fear of a soldier who knows what he is facing. It was a cold, creeping horror of something completely unknown, something that moved through the void without fear or haste, something that had destroyed one of his ships without even trying, something that had come from nowhere, announced nothing, and now just sat in the dark on the edge of Union space, waiting with a patience that felt almost deliberate, almost like a message. I am here. I know you see me, and I am in no hurry. Kett picked up his communication device and filed another report. He marked it as absolute emergency, just like the first one. Then he went back to staring at the map. The ship sat in the dark and waited. The Union didn't sleep while the unknown ship waited. Every admiral of the Outer Rim Defensive Fleet was recalled from leave. Every warship within 3 sectors was ordered to move to a holding position near the Dead Star system where the strange ship sat silently. Supply ships were loaded and dispatched. Fighter squadrons were placed on full alert. Communication arrays throughout the Outer Rim were tuned to maximum sensitivity and pointed at that single stationary point in space, listening for anything. Nothing came. In the Senate Hall on Velprime, the emergency sessions ceased, being sessions and turned into a constant state of panic dressed in official robes. Senators argued all night and the next day. They argued about what the ship was. They argued about what to do. They argued about who should command the response. They argued about whether the response should be military, diplomatic, or scientific. The only thing no one argued about was that the ship was dangerous. On that, everyone agreed. High Commander Vilkrat took personal command of the assembled fleet. 12,000 warships now formed a massive shell of metal and firepower around the Dead Star system. They were from 40 different member states. Dominion dreadnoughts sat next to Serialite patrol cruisers, Brith science vessels hidden behind galley battle platforms. It was the largest fleet assembly in memory. The combined firepower of those 12,000 ships could have turned a small planet into gravel. Vilkrat ordered the fleet to keep a distance of 10,000 kilometers from the unknown ship. From that distance, they could see it clearly on visual sensors. The ship was large, not the largest ship the Union had ever built. They had dreadnoughts the size of cities in their most powerful fleets, but it was big, perhaps 3 kilometers from one end to the other. What was striking was not its size, but its appearance. The hull looked like a history book written in metal. The oldest sections of the ship were dark and heavily armored, built from a dull gray material that Union metallurgical scanners couldn't fully identify. It was extremely dense, extremely hard, and showed signs of age that potentially stretched back hundreds of years. Over this old frame, new sections had been added panels of brighter material, different textures, different construction styles, layered over each other like rings in a tree. The ship had been added to, rebuilt, and repaired so many times that it looked almost organic, like something that had grown rather than been built. Deep scars ran along both sides. Some were old burns from weapons that had struck the hull in the distant past. Others were patches of damage that had been repaired with obvious care, as if whoever maintained this ship took pride in keeping it whole even when it was damaged. There were places along the sides of the ship where it was clearly visible that sections had been replaced entirely. The new material was still slightly brighter than the aged hull around it. The ship had gone through battles, many of them over a very long time. It was still there, still intact, still functional. That bothered Vilkrat more than anything. He gave the order for the communications team to transmit the standard Union greeting protocol. It was a message designed over thousands of years, specifically for such a situation. First contact with a civilization previously unknown to the Union. It was broadcast in 200 languages simultaneously, covering all the major language families in the known galaxy. It identified the Union, explained that the region was sovereign Union space, and asked the unknown ship to identify itself and state its intentions. It was the 200th use of this protocol in Union history. In all previous cases, a response had come within minutes. The communications team transmitted the message. They sent it on all available frequencies. They sent it as sound, light pulses, and data streams in all known encoding formats. They sent it once, then again, then again. 47 minutes of silence passed. Then the unknown ship replied. It replied simultaneously on all frequencies, not just communications frequencies, but all of them. The signal was so broad and powerful that it overloaded the secondary receivers on ships 1,500 kilometers from the source. It came in 200 languages, perfectly reproduced with native-level fluency in each of them. The message consisted of 4 words in every language. In Standard Dominion, the most common language in the Union, it read, "We, humanity, have been looking for you for a very long time." A complete silence descended on the communications room. Vilkrat read the message twice. Then he slowly said, "Run the species identifier. Compare it against all known civilizations in the Union database and the preliminary observation archive." The database search took 90 seconds. That was a long time for a system that usually processed requests in fractions of a second. It meant the database was working at its limit. The result came back as a single line of text. One possible match. 12% confidence. Archive file. Case 3301. Alpha. Vilkrat opened the file. It was old, 3,000 years old by the timestamp. It was a survey report from a Union scout ship that had been mapping the outer regions of what was now the inner territory of the Dominion. Standard procedure: fly through an area of space, mark any inhabited or potentially inhabited worlds, file a report, and move on. The scout ship had discovered a small planet in an unremarkable solar system, one yellow star, 8 planets, the third of which showed signs of primitive biological life. The report noted the presence of what the scout group classified as a pre-spacefaring biological civilization living on the third planet. They noted the species in passing. They recorded the world's coordinates. They estimated the civilization as low development, without strategic value. Contact not recommended at this stage. They had not returned to the world. As recorded in the Scout Journal's own notes, using data obtained from the planet's primitive radio transmissions, it was Earth. Vilkrat stared at the word for a moment. Then he entered the coordinates for Earth into the current galactic map. The map highlighted the location. It wasn't in the outer rim. It wasn't in some distant, unexplored corner of the galaxy. The coordinates placed Earth squarely in the heart of what was now the core of Dominion territory, deep inside Union space, surrounded on all sides by inhabited Union worlds, Union military installations, and Union shipping lanes. Vilkrat leaned back in his command chair and stared at the screen. The implications were immense, and they were bad. A species had lived inside Union territory, not outside, not on the border, but inside for 3,000 years, and the Union had simply forgotten about them. They had been noted in a study, saved in an archive, never followed up on, and eventually lost in an archive so deep that the database had only found it with a 12% confidence rating after 90 seconds of intensive searching. 3,000 years ago, humanity had been an early, pre-spacefaring species by galactic standards. And now, one of their ships sat 3 kilometers wide on the edge of Union space, answering a message in 200 languages simultaneously, having apparently crossed the entire breadth of Dominion territory to get here. Vilkrat thought about what that meant. He thought about how long it would take and what kind of civilization would make such a journey, and what that civilization might have learned in 3,000 years of living, surrounded by an empire that didn't know they existed. He thought about the 3 scout cruisers, about the one that didn't survive. He thought about the scars on the ship's hull and all the battles it had been through. And yet, it sat there, unblemished, waiting. He looked around his command bridge. His officers were looking at him. Every face in the room was waiting for his decision. He made the wrong one. It wasn't entirely his fault. He had been taught his whole life to respond to unknown threats with force. The Union had maintained its 6,000 years of peace by meeting every challenge with overwhelming force. Every uprising had been crushed. Every defiant species had been brought back into submission. The Union's might was built on the absolute certainty that no one could stand against them. And that certainty, lasting 6,000 years, had become a kind of reflex. The unknown ship had entered Union space without permission. It had destroyed a Union ship. It had refused communication for days, and now it had answered a greeting in a way that implied it had been watching and studying the Union long enough to perfectly learn 200 of its languages. This was not the behavior of a civilization that needed to be greeted. In Vilkrat's experience, in the Union's long, proud experience, this was the behavior of someone who needed to be stopped. He gave the order to fire. 12,000 warships opened fire simultaneously. The combined fire was extraordinary. Energy beams, mass driver projectiles, torpedo salvos from hundreds of launchers, focused plasma lances from Dominion dreadnoughts. Everything converged on the unknown ship in one massive volley, a wall of destruction that lit up that region of space brighter than the nearby dead star. The impact was spectacular. The sensors lit up with readings. Tactical screens showed energy readings off the scale. Vilkrat waited for confirmation of destruction. It didn't come. The sensor readings stabilized. The light faded. The tactical screens recalibrated. The ship was still there, exactly where it had been. Exactly the same. It hadn't drifted. It wasn't damaged. It didn't lean to one side. Its hull showed no new damage. Its energy readings hadn't changed at all. It sat in the void like a mountain sits on the earth, completely unmoved by what had just been thrown at it. Not a single flicker of a shield. Not a single visible mark from the impact of the most powerful simultaneous weapons salvo in the history of the Union military service. The command bridge of Vilkrat's flagship was absolutely silent for 3 very long seconds. Then all communication channels opened simultaneously. The voice that spoke was calm, It sounded human, not harsh, not mechanical, not alien in the way Vilkrat had expected from a truly foreign species. It was a simple, even voice, speaking first in standard Dominion and then, in the same breath, in the native tongue of every species whose ship was in range. It said, "This is a mistake. You fired first. We want this to be clearly understood. You fired first, and we did not return fire. We are recording everything. Every species in this fleet will be able to verify what happened here. You fired at a ship that did nothing but communicate with you." A pause. When the voice returned, it was still calm. That calmness was somehow more terrifying than anger. "We will give you one chance to fix this mistake. We are not asking you to surrender. We are not asking you to retreat. We are asking you to stop, think about what you have just done, and decide if you want to continue down this path, because we have been patient for a very long time. We have been waiting for this conversation longer than there have been living members in your Senate. We did not come here to fight you." Another pause. "But we are very, very good at doing that. So think carefully before you fire again." The channel closed. Vilkrat sat in his chair and said nothing. Around him, his officers were perfectly still. No one moved, no one spoke. The Outer Rim Defensive Fleet, the 12,000 most powerful warships in the galaxy, stood in formation around a single ship that had absorbed their full fire without a single scratch. And the universe, in that moment, felt a little different than it had before. A little smaller. It was a feeling Vilkrat was not used to. It was a feeling no Union officer was used to. For 6,000 years, the universe had felt like something the Union owned, something they controlled, something that would bow before their will because they always bowed before their will. This ship did not bow. Vilkrat looked at the sensor screen, at the single point of mass sitting perfectly motionless in the dead star system. Then he looked at the communications officer. "Connect me to the Senate," he said. His voice was steady. He had been a soldier too long to let it tremble, but his hands, under the armrests of his command chair where no one could see them, were pressed hard against his legs, because if he didn't press them, they would have been shaking. The ensuing Senate session was the longest in Union history. It lasted 14 hours without a break. By the end of the session, the room smelled of stress, cold food, and the biological products of 400 species sitting too close to each other for too long. Tempers flared, cooled, and flared again. There were 2 separate incidents where senators of different species had to be physically separated by the hall guards. But in the end, a decision was made. The Union would treat the situation as an act of war. The unknown ship, which the military had begun to refer to simply as Target 1 in its reports, because no one liked saying the name out loud, the ship they couldn't damage, would be attacked with all available force until it was destroyed or forced to surrender. Simultaneously, a secondary fleet would be sent to the coordinates of the planet Earth to assess any civilization existing there and determine the degree of threat. The session was archived and sealed under top-level classification. What happened next? The Union would later spend a lot of time trying to explain it as anything other than what it was. They would use words like tactical maneuver and strategic engagement in their official reports. They would describe it as a complex and sophisticated military operation. The truth was simpler. The truth was that the Union attacked something it didn't understand and couldn't damage. And what followed were 9 days of the most complete and humiliating military defeat any power in the galaxy had ever suffered. It began on the morning of the second day after the fleet had first opened fire. Target 1, which the crew of the ship by that time had identified by name in several subsequent broadcasts. The ship was called the UNSV Prometheus. The letters stood for United Nations Space Vessel. Names that meant nothing to Union intelligence at the time started to move. It moved slowly at first, not with the terrifying speed it had shown entering the Outer Rim. It floated out of the dead star system and entered the edge of the assembled fleet. Vilkrat ordered another full volley. The Prometheus absorbed it as it had absorbed everything else. Then it moved between the ships. That was what made the fleet commanders feel something more than simple fear. The Prometheus didn't rush. It didn't sweep through the fleet with the terrifying speed with which it had entered Union space. It moved relatively moderately fast, but not impossibly so. What it did as it moved was precise, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. It targeted systems, not ships. As the Prometheus moved through the assembled fleet, it fired not the massive energy weapons that Union warships used, designed for punching through armor, destroying engines, and killing the crew. The weapons the Prometheus used were different. They were focused, narrow, and precisely aimed at specific parts of specific ships. A beam would reach out and strike a propulsion unit, not the whole engine, just the primary coupling. Another hit the weapons power system. Another traced across a dreadnought sensor array with surgical precision, leaving the hull completely undamaged but making the ship blind. Ship after ship in the fleet suddenly found itself unable to move, fire, or see, yet not destroyed. The crew was unharmed. Life support systems were unharmed. The ships were still there, still full of living soldiers. They just couldn't do anything else. Word spread quickly through the fleet. The Prometheus wasn't killing anyone, it was disabling ships. This realization caused two very different reactions, depending on where in the fleet the information was received. Among the Dominion officers and other inner-core species, those who held the most power in the Union, the reaction was rage. Disabling ships instead of destroying them felt like a mockery. It felt like being looked at with contempt. It felt like a very clear understanding that your enemy could kill you if they wanted to and had simply decided not to. Among the smaller species, the Brith, the Keth, the Sarat, and dozens of civilizations that had been members of the Union for centuries but always sat at the bottom of the Senate's power structure, the reaction was different. They watched as the ship absorbed the full fire of 12,000 warships without a single scratch, and then responded by disabling enemy ships with the care of a surgeon, not the destruction of a killer. They began to think. On the third day, the Prometheus transmitted another message. This time, it wasn't addressed to Vilkrat or the Senate. It was broadcast on all frequencies, to all ships in the fleet, and clearly reached relay stations deep on the Empire's borders. Millions of beings on dozens of worlds received the broadcast simultaneously. It wasn't a threatening message, it was a statement of facts. The Prometheus listed, one by one, what they had done since the initial encounter. They named every ship they had disabled. They accurately described which systems they had targeted and what they had left untouched. They stated clearly and repeatedly that not a single Union life had been lost since the initial encounter. The death of the scout cruiser crew was acknowledged and described as an accident caused by the Prometheus, which had not expected the ships to be so close to its path at high speed. Then, they released an archive file, a 300-year-old scout journal, Case 3301, Alpha, which had documented the planet Earth, evaluated it as low development, without strategic value, and never returned. Every being in the fleet heard it. Every sensor operator, navigator, gunner, and junior officer heard the voices of the scout group describing the little blue world and its early civilization, noting it as unimportant, and leaving. And then they heard the crew of the Prometheus calmly and without anger explaining what had happened to that little blue world in the 3,000 years since it had been forgotten. The smaller species in the fleet began talking to each other. On the fourth day, something happened that Vilkrat hadn't prepared for or predicted, and that he would later describe as the moment he realized the situation could no longer be recovered. New ships appeared in Union space. They didn't pass through monitored sensor regions. They didn't emerge from hyperspace at known jump points or entry corridors that Union navigators had mapped and watched. They appeared from unexpected places, from behind the dark side of moons, from within dense asteroid fields, from regions of space that Union sensors read as empty. The first ship to appear there was detected by a standard patrol vessel near Nebula G, deep inside Union territory. The patrol vessel challenged the new contact. The answer came in the same calm, clear manner as from the Prometheus. The ship identified itself as UNSV Endurance. It wasn't hostile, it was simply in Union space with a transponder openly broadcasting. Within 6 hours, 40 more ships appeared, not grouped together, but scattered across a vast part of Union space. Each one had appeared from a hidden location. Each one was transmitting the same open identification signal. None of them fired at anything. By the end of the 5th day, their number exceeded 300. Union intelligence fell into a controlled panic. Internal reports, which were immediately classified but later extracted and read by a large number of people, described a complex infiltration operation that could have taken years. Human-designed ships had been hiding in Union space not just on the edges, but throughout its space, in several sectors, occupying positions that any military analyst could see were chosen for strategic coverage, not convenience. Humanity hadn't accidentally stumbled into Union space. They had been mapping it from within. Vilkrat received intelligence reports one after another each day, while his fleet continued its unsuccessful encounter with the Prometheus. He read each one, he made notes, He filed responses requesting additional information that came less and less often, because intelligence was too busy trying to track all the new ships appearing throughout the Empire. On the 6th day, 3 of the Union's smaller species sent a message not to Vilcrat, not to the Senate. They sent them directly to the Prometheus. The Brith's message was the most direct. It said, "We are not your enemies. We did not fire on your ship. We ask that this be noted." The Keth's message was similar. The Sarat's message was longer, and included a formal statement of grievances against the Dominion that had obviously been building for several hundred years and was now being presented to an outside party for the first time. By the 7th day, 6 more species had sent similar messages. 3 of them quietly began moving their ships out of the fleet formation and relocating them to holding positions on the edge of the encounter zone. Vilcrat sent orders demanding a return to formation. 2 species complied. 4? No. The Union's united front was cracking at the seams. On the 8th day, the Prometheus changed what it was doing. It stopped moving through the fleet. It slowly, deliberately picked up speed, building it in a way that Union sensors could clearly track and predict. Every tracking station in the fleet had its course plotted. Before it approached, the direction was obvious. The Prometheus was heading for Velpreme, the capital world. Vilcrat sent the fleet's fastest ships to intercept it before it could reach the inner systems. He had no reason to believe they would stop it. Nothing had stopped it yet, but he couldn't just let it fly through Union territory to the Senate Hall without trying. The interceptor fleet took up positions. The Prometheus flew right through them. It didn't fire once. It disabled the engines of every ship that moved directly into its path with the same precise, non-lethal targeting it had demonstrated from the beginning. And it just continued its course. It entered orbit over Velpreme at dawn on the 9th day. It was visible from the surface, a dark figure against the pale blue sky of the planet, slowly moving across the horizon, catching the sunlight in a way that made it seem almost beautiful from the ground. People in the capital stopped on the streets and looked up. Children pointed their fingers. The news broadcasts that had been covering the fleet encounter with bated breath suddenly fell silent as their cameras turned toward the sky. The Prometheus didn't fire a single shot. It didn't threaten. It didn't make demands. It simply, slowly, visibly, and undeniably hung in orbit. The Senate Hall, which sat under that sky, held an emergency vote within 3 hours after the Prometheus took its orbit. The vote concerned one question. Should the Union request a truce? The vote was not close. High Admiral Vilcrat received the Senate's authorization shortly after noon. He held it in his hands for a moment, a physical document, printed in the old formal style the Senate used for decisions of historical importance. His name was on it. His seal was on it. He was the one who would send the message. He thought about his 30 years of service. He thought about the Union's 6,000 years of history. He thought about the fleet behind him, hundreds of disabled ships drifting in the outer system, and the clean, unblemished hull of the Prometheus moving calmly overhead. He thought about the Scout Journal, the forgotten world, the little blue planet evaluated as having no strategic value 3,000 years ago. He picked up the communication device and opened a channel to the Prometheus. "This is High Admiral Vilcrat of the Union's Outer Rim Defensive Fleet," he said. "I am transmitting a formal request for an immediate truce on behalf of the Galactic Senate of the Union." He set the document down. The reply from the Prometheus came in less than 4 minutes. "Truce accepted. All United Nations ships will stop immediately. We are ready to negotiate when you are ready." Vilcrat looked at the clock. In fact, it was less than 4 minutes. The exact time was on his screen, 3 minutes and 47 seconds from the moment the truce request was sent to the moment of confirmation. The Prometheus. He had participated in enough negotiations in his career to know what such a fast response time meant. It meant the other side was ready. It meant the answer had been prepared in advance, waiting only for the question. He thought about all the human ships hidden throughout Union space. He thought about the Prometheus absorbing the fire of 12,000 warships simultaneously. He thought about the 3,000 years of silence, the 3 minutes and 47 seconds, because they knew he would ask. They had also planned for this moment. He looked up at the sky at the dark figure of the Prometheus moving in high orbit, leisurely, patient, huge, scarred, and completely intact. 9 days. The encounter had lasted 9 days. The Union called it a war. Humanity, Vilcrat suspected, called it something else. They had expected a warship inside. Every member of the Union delegation boarding the Prometheus imagined what it would look like inside. The picture was roughly the same for everyone, formed by their own military experience and how the ship had behaved during the 9-day encounter. They expected weapon racks on the walls. They expected dim lighting and bare metal corridors. They expected trophies, perhaps markings of past victory, the things that warlike cultures always displayed to impress visitors and remind guests what they were dealing with. They expected to feel small when they walked through the airlock. The Prometheus was not what they expected. The delegation was brought to the ship on a standard Union shuttle. There were 8 of them: High Admiral Vilkrat, 3 senior senators representing the Dominion, and 2 representatives of allied species. 2 intelligence officers and a xenobiologist from the Brith who had specifically requested to be included and spent the shuttle flight pressed against the viewport with large, golden eyes that seemed unable to look anywhere else. The docking procedure went smoothly. Whatever the Prometheus's systems were, they were fully compatible with Union shuttle technology, which, as the intelligence officers noted quietly in their logs, was significant. The airlock opened from the inside before the delegation had finished checking the docking sequence. The corridor beyond it was wide and well lit. The light was warm, not cold and blue-white like Union warships, but softer, closer to the light of a star. The walls were clean. The floor was made of some dark material that yielded slightly underfoot, absorbing sound. On the walls hung artwork. That was the first thing that made the delegation freeze. Artwork, paintings, and photographs in frames, placed at even intervals along the corridor walls. Some were landscapes, blue oceans under yellow-white suns, mountains with white peaks against a pale sky. Some were abstract colors layered on the surface in patterns that seemed meaningful but were not clearly readable. Some were portraits of human beings, the delegation realized. The species whose ship they were visiting, diverse faces, different ages, different expressions. One of the Dominion senators looked at the paintings and said nothing. He had been a soldier for 50 years. He had boarded many enemy ships after battles. On none of them were there paintings in the corridors. They were met by a young man who introduced himself simply as the ship's communications officer. He was shorter than every member of the delegation. Humans, it turned out, were not particularly tall by galactic standards. He had dark skin and a calm, professional air, and he spoke in standard Dominion with perfect fluency and only a slight accent. He greeted them aboard the Prometheus without ceremony and led them through the ship. The walk to the conference room took several minutes. They passed through several more corridors, through a large open area where crew members sat at workstations, monitoring systems, past a section that smelled of food being prepared somewhere nearby. Passing humans looked at the delegation with curiosity, not hostility. Some nodded. A few stopped what they were doing to look at the visiting alien guests. No one reached for a weapon, no one spoke in hushed, urgent tones as the delegation passed by. The ship seemed inhabited. That was the word the Brith xenobiologist used later when writing his report. It seemed like a place where people had spent real time, not just a machine built for battle. At the workstations were mugs. On the shelves were personal items, and small plants in containers were secured to the wall light fixtures. The plants had small flowers. The flowers were yellow. The conference room was the last thing any of them expected. It was a warm, circular space with a large round table in the center. The chairs around the table were adjusted. Each of them was a different shape, built to accommodate different body types, different physiologies. Vilkrat looked at his chair. It was built for a Dominion frame, large and wide, with armrests at the correct height for 4-armed creatures. The senator from the Brith saw a seat that was narrower and lower, with the kind of back support needed for a Brith spine when sitting for a long time. Every member of the delegation found a chair that fit them, as if it had been built specifically for them, because that was exactly what it was. In the center of the table was food and drink, a wide assortment of items presented in small containers, dishes, and cups, arranged so that every delegate had options from their own world's cuisine or an approximation of it. Vilkrat looked at the cup before him. He reached out and picked it up. He inhaled. It was Tetbrod, a Dominion drink, traditional, warm, made from a plant that grew only on the northern plains of the Dominion's home world. It was a drink served to someone returning home after a long absence, or when they needed comfort, or when you wanted to say without words that you knew who they were and had prepared specifically for them. He set it down without drinking. The intelligence officers looked at the food before them. They stared at it like it was an unexploded ordnance, cautiously, not touching it. Then the door at the far end of the room opened, and a human delegation entered. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all in simple dark clothing with a small badge on their chests. A circle with a pattern inside that the xenobiologist later identified as a stylized image of planet Earth. Their ages ranged from 35 to a woman who was clearly the oldest human in the room and moved with the careful stability of someone in their 70s. This woman sat at the head of the table opposite Vilkrat. She looked at him for a moment and then smiled. It was a real smile, not a diplomatic performance. Her eyes were dark and clear, and in them was that steady focus Vilkrat associated with people who had seen many difficult things and come through them without breaking. Her name, announced by the communications officer, was Ambassador Yaroken. She was a political officer on the Prometheus, a role she had held since the ship's launch. She was the lead negotiator for humanity. She said in standard Dominion, "Thank you for coming. Please, have something to eat. We traveled a long way, and we like to share food when we meet people." One of the Dominion senators said dryly, "We are here to discuss terms." "Yes," Yarochin said, "we are. But first, I would like to know how everyone is doing. Do you like the Tet broad? I was told it should be served warm, but not hot." Vilkrat looked at the cup. He looked at the elderly woman at the table. He picked up the cup and took a sip. The taste was exactly right. Something about that was more disturbing than anything the Prometheus had done in 9 days of battle. The terms humanity presented were not the terms of conquest. That was the second surprise of the day. And for some members of the delegation, it was more significant. They had arrived prepared for demands, reparations, territory, resource agreements, the things that winning powers in galactic history always extracted from the defeated. They had lists ready of what they were willing to give up and what they would firmly defend. Vilkrat had 3 separate negotiation strategies outlined in the sealed briefcase next to him. He never opened it. Yaroken laid one document on the table. It was a physical document, thin, flat, clearly printed, not a data file. It consisted of 10 pages. She pushed it toward the center of the table and said, "These are our terms. Read them, please. All of them. Take your time." The delegation read. The terms were 4. The first demanded a formal acknowledgement from the Union that planet Earth had been surveyed, catalogued, and never followed up on a violation of the Union's own founding charter, which required that any catalogued habitable world receive a follow-up contact assessment from the moment of first documentation. The second demanded the immediate and complete withdrawal of all Dominion military and administrative assets from the Sol system, the solar system containing Earth, and the establishment of Earth's sovereign territory as a protected zone in accordance with standard Union law. The third was the one that made every member of the Dominion delegation straighten up by the time they reached it. It demanded that humanity be accepted into the Galactic Union, not as a new applicant, but as a retroactive founding signatory. The legal argument was laid out in a footnote that the intelligence officers silently read for several minutes. The Union's founding charter, written 6,000 years ago, established that any surveyed and documented civilization could be considered a member from the date of its first documentation. Earth had been documented 3,000 years ago. Humanity, technically by the Union's own law, had been a member of the Union for 3,000 years. They weren't asking for membership, they were claiming it. The fourth point demanded full access to all Union records regarding Earth. Every study, every observation file, every piece of data gathered by the Union about the human world, everything was to be released, completely and without redaction. That was it. 4 terms. No territorial demands, no reparations for the attack, no military concessions or fleet reductions, no demand that the Union acknowledge defeat. Supreme Consul Draven, the leading Dominion senator in the delegation, read the document twice, looked at Yarochin, and asked, "Is that all?" "That is all," she said. "No reparations? No military terms?" "Non." Draven studied her for a moment. His 4 large arms were folded on the table in a clear display of control. "You absorbed the combined fire of 12,000 warships and suffered no damage. Your ships are currently positioned throughout Union space in locations that would give you a significant strategic advantage in any further encounter. You demonstrated that we cannot harm you, and your terms, these 4 points?" "Yes," Yarochen said. "Why?" Draven asked. She looked at him steadily. "Because we didn't come here to break things. We came here for what has always belonged to us." She pushed the document slightly toward him. "We want what we are entitled to under the Charter. We want our record cleared. We want our solar system. We want the seat at the table that should have been offered to us 3,000 years ago. That is all." Draven looked at the document for a long time. Then he asked the question everyone present had been thinking since the moment they boarded the ship. He asked it quietly, without aggression, in the tone of a man who simply needed to know, "How many ships do you have?" The room was very quiet. Yarachin looked at him. Then she picked up the small cup of tea that sat before her. One of the human delegation members had brought a small brewing device and done so during the reading, filling the room with a faint, pleasant scent, and she took a slow sip. She set the cup down. She did not answer the question. Instead, she looked at the full delegation and said, "I would like to suggest a short break before we begin the official session. In the corridor to the left, there are restrooms equipped for your various needs. We also have a small meal prepared. If anyone is hungry." She stood up, smoothing her dark jacket. "The document remains in force," she said. "We are ready for formalization whenever the Senate is ready to respond." She walked to the edge of the room and quietly began talking to one of her delegation members about something unrelated, completely relaxed, as if the conversation that had just taken place were an ordinary and unremarkable moment in her day. Vilkrat sat in his chair and looked at the document on the table. He thought about the question Draven had asked, and the answer that hadn't been given. He thought about all the human ships located throughout Union space, the ones they knew about, and the ones they certainly didn't. He thought about the 3,000 years of preparation and the 9-day encounter, the end of which humanity had obviously already planned before it began. He picked up his cup of tetbrod and finished it. It was still warm. They had timed it perfectly. Of course they had. It took another 3 days of formal session aboard the Prometheus before all 4 terms were agreed upon, and the final document was prepared. The signing ceremony was short and almost quiet compared to what had preceded it. High Admiral Vilkrat added his seal. Supreme Consul the Exanatene two representatives of the smaller Union species invited as independent witnesses, the Brith and the Keth, who had been among the first to privately contact the human fleet during the encounter, signed as observers. Yarachin signed for humanity with an ordinary writing instrument she carried in her jacket pocket. She didn't make a speech. She didn't mark the moment with a ceremony. She looked at the completed document for a moment, nodded to herself, and said, "All right, thank you, everyone." Then she asked if anyone wanted more tea. The formal report the Union Senate released to its member states the following week described the agreement in cautious, measured language. It acknowledged the rediscovery of a previously documented species. It laid out the terms of Earth's formal membership. It described the previous 9-day encounter with the flattest and most neutral language the Senate communications team could use. It spoke as little as possible about what had actually happened. The true story, however, spread on its own. Crew members of ships disabled during the encounter told their families what they had seen. Officers who had watched as 12,000 warships failed to leave a mark on one ship described it in letters home that were passed around and read by people who passed them on further. Delegations of Brith and Keth, no longer bound by Dominion intelligence protocols, spoke openly to their people. And then there was the broadcast the Prometheus itself had released during the encounter, the one that carried the 300-year-old scout journal, the one that went out on all frequencies to every ship and station in range. That broadcast was not restricted. It spread through relay stations deeper and deeper into Union space, and millions of beings heard it, and millions of others heard about it secondhand. And by the time the cautious official Senate report was released, most of the galaxy already knew the basis of the story. A species was forgotten. They grew anyway. They returned. The details slowly filled in over the following months as humanity began to release its own account of events. They did this through their own access to the Union's communication network, which they now had full access to in a series of broadcasts and documents that were dry, factual, and completely devoid of self-aggrandizement, which somehow made them more convincing to read than any boastful tale. Scout ship KKS 3301 Alpha had passed through the Sol system 312 years ago. Its journal, extracted and released in full in accordance with the agreement's terms, showed that the scout group had spent about 4 hours scanning Earth and its neighboring planets before completing their assessment and moving on. They noted signs of a developing civilization. They labeled the world as non-threatening. They filed their report. The file went into the archive, and no one ever opened it again. In the 312 years that followed, much happened on Earth. Humanity fought wars, many of them, some so destructive they almost destroyed the species. They poisoned parts of their planet so severely that they changed the climate. They survived plagues. They faced internal conflicts that split civilizations at the root, dividing nations against each other along lines of culture, belief, and resources. They had come close to the brink of their own extinction many times over the centuries, and they always came back. They pulled themselves back from the edge of every crisis, not through luck, but through what one human historian, writing for the document Release, described as the characteristic stubbornness of a species that, not once in its entire evolutionary history, was prepared to admit that something was impossible. They reached space on their own without guidance, without help, without any of the technological exchange that Union members gave each other. They built their first generation of spacecraft from scratch through trial and error, catastrophe, and learning, and then trying again. Their first missions beyond their world were slow, fragile, and dangerous. Dozens of early astronauts, as they called their space travelers, died in the process. They kept moving forward. Then, about 800 years before the Prometheus arrived at the outer rim, a deep space scout group discovered something unexpected near the edge of the solar system: humanity. Caught in the gravitational wake of a wandering dwarf planet was a piece of ancient technology, not human technology, but alien. A very old deep space relay station, automated, long since exhausted of power, but with an intact data storage. The station was Union technology, from the same period as scout ship KKS-3301 Alpha. The data extracted from the station was deciphered over decades. Human linguists and historians worked on it for generations, but eventually they cracked it, language by language, and what they found inside was not just one scout journal. It was a partial map of the galaxy, records of hundreds of civilizations, notes of thousands of years of Union research, a window into a galaxy that was inhabited, almost incomprehensibly so, and which had looked at humanity and decided they weren't worth stopping. The decision that followed wasn't made in a single meeting. It wasn't the decision of one leader or one generation. It was a conversation humanity had been having with itself for several hundred years. They knew they weren't alone. They knew that somewhere out there, in a galaxy full of civilizations, an empire of 400 species could appear over their world without warning and do whatever it pleased. They knew they had been seen and ignored, which meant they could be seen again, at any time, by anyone. And the next visitor might not be as indifferent as the scout group. They had two choices. The first, declare themselves, broadcast a signal, invite contact, openly step into the galactic community, and see what happened. This option was widely debated. It was eventually set aside, not out of fear, but out of a specific and carefully considered concern. Humanity had read the Union records. They had studied the history of the empire that had surrounded their solar system without knowing it. They saw a pattern. Species that were discovered before they were strong enough to negotiate from any position of strength were absorbed, diminished, or became dependent members of a structure built without them in mind. They had no interest in being absorbed. The second choice: prepare, grow quietly, evolve, without attracting attention. Use the knowledge from the relay station to learn everything they could about the galaxy around them before taking a single step into it. Be patient and be ready before becoming visible. They chose patience. The ships appeared first, a fleet built over generations. Each vessel was designed using technology drawn from everything humanity learned, both from their own research and from a slow, thorough analysis of the Union technical records extracted from the relay station. Human engineers worked at the limit. They had no trade partners of any species from whom to buy technology. No shortcuts were available to them. What they built from their own knowledge, and therefore it was truly theirs, not a copy, not an approximation, but the result of human intellect solving problems that the Union solved one way, and finding, in many cases, completely different ways of solving them. In some cases, better ways. The shields that absorbed 12,000 simultaneously firing warships were one example. The propulsion system that allowed the Prometheus to cross Union space in the time it did was another. These weren't stolen technologies. These were human technologies grown from human science, shaped by human necessity, the necessity of a species that had no backup option and therefore could not afford to be satisfied with good enough when the best was attainable. Then came the intelligence operation. The ships that had been hiding throughout Union space had been placed over nearly 30 years, moving quietly and carefully, using a technique that exploited a gap in the Union's sensor technology revealed by human engineers from the extracted records. The ships operated cold and silent, using minimal power, staying in positions chosen specifically because Union patrol routes avoided them. They didn't all go at once. That would have been detectable. They went one or two at a time for decades, slipping into position, freezing, and waiting. By the time the Prometheus crossed the outer rim, humanity had been in Union space for 3 decades. The 9-day encounter, as the Prometheus crews explained in their documents, was planned, not expected. The response to the truce request took 4 minutes because the text had already been written and was waiting to be sent. The conference room aboard the Prometheus, with its custom chairs, tetbrod, and carefully prepared food from each delegate's home world, had been equipped weeks before the ship entered Union space because the people who planned the mission calculated that a truce and negotiations were the most likely outcome if the initial encounter was handled correctly. Correctly meant, don't kill anyone, don't destroy anything that can't be replaced, be invincible but don't punish them for trying. Let the smaller species see what you are doing. Let the Empire's internal tensions do some of the work. Make it clear that you can end the conversation at any moment you choose, but that what you actually want is the conversation. It worked exactly to plan. The release of documents and the slow spread of the story among the Union population had consequences the Senate had not foreseen and could not control. Among the Dominion and other inner core species, the powerful who had ruled the Union for millennia, the reaction was a predominantly deeply uncomfortable reevaluation. They had fired first. Their own records confirmed it. The Prometheus's records confirmed it. Every censor journal of every ship in the fleet confirmed it. The most powerful military force in the galaxy had opened fire on a ship that had done nothing but communicate. And the ship had absorbed the attack without harm and responded not with destruction, but with precision, restraint, and documentation. They couldn't get rid of the story. They couldn't present it as a victory. They couldn't archive it in a deep archive like they had archived the Scout Journal of the Little Blue World 3,000 years ago. Among the smaller species of the Union, those who had always been at the bottom of the Senate's power, who had always benefited from the Union's protection but had never been equal partners in it, the reaction was something else. It was quiet, and it was strong, and it manifested in Senate voting patterns in subsequent years in ways the Dominion found increasingly frustrating. Humanity had done what no species in the Union had ever managed. They had demonstrated before the entire galaxy that the Dominion was not invincible. Not because they had defeated them in a traditional sense, no world burned, no fleet was destroyed. There was no demand for surrender, but because they had stood before the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and it had broken against them. And afterward, the stories, the records, and the honest accounting of what had happened were in plain sight, where everyone could see them. It changed things quietly, slowly, as it would take years to fully measure. But it did change. 6 months after the signing, Ambassador Yarachen took a trip to Velprime. She was provided quarters in the Senate district, modest rooms, with which she reportedly expressed satisfaction. She attended a series of formal introductory sessions with Senate officials from various species. She was introduced to Union procedures and received a workspace in the Senate building. On the morning of her first official session as a permanent member, she arrived early. She took the seat assigned to humanity, a new seat added to the outer ring of the hall, and looked around. The hall slowly filled. Senators arrived in small groups, took their seats, and talked with colleagues. Many of them looked at her, some with hostility, some with curiosity, some, especially from the smaller species, with an expression she recognized as something close to how one looks at someone who has done what you have long wanted someone else to do. The session chairman called the hall to order. The formal greeting to a new member, prescribed by the Union Charter, was read aloud, a long and ceremonial text that had been read 400 times in Union history. Each time a new species took its seat, it greeted the new member. It welcomed them into the community of the galaxy. It declared the rights and responsibilities of membership. When it was finished, the session chairman performed the traditional courtesy. She looked at the newest member of the Union Senate and asked if they had anything to say before the start of today's hearings. The hall was quiet. Yarachen stood. She was the shortest being in the room. She was the oldest delegate in the hall. She stood straight and looked around the room, all 400 species, all the power and history, the weight of 6,000 years of galactic civilization, and her expression was completely calm. She said, "We have been waiting 3,000 years for this meeting." She looked at the session chairman. She looked at the Dominion senators. She looked at the Brith delegate, who was watching her with large golden eyes that, if you looked closely, were slightly wet. Let's not waste it. The hall exploded. Not in a way that meant anger or disorder, but as if something had broken that had been waiting a very long time to break. Species that had never agreed on anything stood up. The sound was huge and complex and different in every part of the room, because creatures express things differently, some through sound, others through movement, others through changes in skin color, or the release of display structures, or the rapid percussion of hard surfaces. It continued for a full minute before the session chairman was able to call for order again. Yarochen sat down again. She straightened the document before her, the agenda for the day, printed in the standard format she had been handed at the door, and clicked her writing instrument once. Back aboard the Prometheus, still in orbit over Velprime, the crew watched the session live in the common room. When the hall exploded, a cheer went through room after room along the entire length of the ship. Crew members hugged each other. Someone put on music. Someone else started crying and then laughed at themselves. The ship's cook, who hadn't slept since early morning, preparing food for the occasion, walked out of the kitchen and stood in the corridor with flour on his hands, looking at the screen, saying nothing for a long time. Somewhere in the galaxy, in a solar system with 1 yellow star and 8 planets, on a world with blue oceans, green land, white clouds, and a long and complex history, morning processions were taking place in several large cities. People were waking up, starting their day, and living their lives the way people do when they don't yet know that something historical has happened somewhere far away. They would know soon. The Union's communications network was fast, and now humanity had full access to it. By evening, every screen on Earth showed an image of a small, fair-haired woman standing in a golden hall full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. By evening, the galaxy would know that the species it had once surveyed, deemed unimportant and forgotten, hadn't forgotten them, had never forgotten them, but had simply been patient. 3,000 years of quiet, deliberate, continuous patience. The patience of a species that had survived everything its own world and its own nature could throw at it, and had come out of it all, not harder, not colder, or more warlike, but more confident, more resilient, more themselves. They hadn't conquered the galaxy. They hadn't humiliated it, hadn't burned it to show they could. They had joined it on their own terms, having done their homework beforehand. And they had walked through the door their own founding charter had left for them 3,000 years ago and simply sat down at the table that had always been theirs. Later, in one of the many profiles dedicated to Yarochen in the following years, a journalist asked her what she was thinking the moment she stood up to address the Senate. She thought for a moment and then smiled. "I was thinking that I needed to adjust the microphone," she said. The chair was a little low. Then she took her cup of tea and changed the subject.